Have you ever wondered how someone can go from being a hero to becoming the villain of their own story? How could a man chosen by God, who began his journey with so much promise, end up as the classic example of tragedy and downfall? The story of King Saul is exactly that, the rise and fall of a leader who had everything in his hands but, through his own choices, watched it all crumble. Stick with me today as we dive deep into this story filled with twists, betrayals, and powerful lessons that still resonate to this day. This man was Saul, a young member of the tribe of Benjamin, tall and imposing, someone who stood out for his appearance and presence. Yet, behind this impressive figure was a humble heart, a man who initially did not see himself as worthy of such great responsibility. Saul led a simple life, tending to his father's donkeys, when a series of events brought him to meet the prophet Samuel. It was a divinely orchestrated encounter, and at that moment, Samuel recognized Saul as God's chosen one to lead Israel. Samuel anointed Saul's head with oil, a sacred symbol that God had set him apart to be king. But Saul, despite his height and physical strength, was an insecure man. When the time came for him to be presented to the people as the new king, he tried to hide, as if he wanted to escape the responsibility God had placed on him. However, there was no avoiding the destiny that awaited him. When he was finally found and brought before the people, Saul was acclaimed as king. The people saw in him a leader who could face their enemies, someone who seemed destined to bring peace and security to Israel. And so, the young Saul, still uncertain and humble, took the throne with the divine mission of leading God's chosen people. In the early days of his reign, Saul proved to be courageous and capable. He led Israel to military victories, freeing cities and defeating enemies that had long oppressed the nation. The people were satisfied. They felt that they finally had a king who could protect them and lead them in times of war. Saul's story began with promises of greatness and blessings, a leader chosen by God himself to guide his people. However, like all great stories, Saul's would not be without challenges. And what started with hope and triumph would soon face trials that would reveal the true character of Israel's first king. Saul's reign began with a series of triumphs that seemed to confirm his selection as the ideal leader for Israel. At first, he was a popular king, admired by his people, and their confidence in his leadership grew as he led the Israelites to several victories over their enemies. One of Saul's first major victories was against the Ammonites, a nation that had brutally threatened an Israelite city called Jabesh-Gilead. The king of the Ammonites, Nahash, had besieged the city and imposed a cruel condition to spare its inhabitants. Every man of Jabesh would have to gouge out his right eye as a symbol of submission. Desperate, the city leaders requested a 7-day truce during which they sent messengers throughout Israel, pleading for help. When the news reached Saul, he was filled with righteous anger. The Spirit of God came upon him, giving him the strength and determination to act quickly. In a bold move, Saul cut a pair of oxen into pieces and sent them throughout the territory of Israel, along with a clear message. Anyone who did not follow Saul and Samuel into battle against the Ammonites would have their oxen treated in the same way. Saul's call to arms mobilized the people, and a large army was gathered. Saul divided his men into 3 groups and launched a surprise attack against the Ammonites in the middle of the night. The victory was overwhelming, and the Ammonites were completely defeated before dawn. The city of Jabesh-Gilead was saved, and Saul's name began to be respected throughout Israel. After this victory, the people gathered at Gilgal to renew the kingdom and reaffirm Saul as their king. It was a moment of celebration and gratitude to God. Samuel, the prophet, offered sacrifices and led the people in worship. On that day, Saul was officially confirmed as the king of Israel, and his reign seemed to promise days of glory and prosperity. These early victories cemented Saul's role as Israel's leader. He had shown courage, military acumen, and, most importantly, a willingness to follow God's guidance. The people were confident that under his leadership, Israel would finally find the peace and security they had longed for. However, this phase of success and unity was only the beginning. The future held challenges that would test not only Saul's military strength but also his faith and obedience to God, revealing the true intentions of the king's heart. As time passed, Saul's leadership began to be marked not just by victories, but also by rash decisions and a growing disobedience to divine commands. It was during one of the most critical military campaigns against the Philistines that the true nature of Saul's heart began to reveal itself, exposing his insecurities and his growing distance from God. Israel's army, led by Saul, faced a significant threat from the Philistines, who had gathered in large numbers to attack. The Israelites were at a disadvantage, and fear spread among the troops. Saul, already impatient and anxious, waited for the prophet Samuel to arrive and offer a sacrifice to God, seeking guidance before the battle. This sacrifice was a sacred ritual, an act that was supposed to be performed only by Samuel, the prophet and priest of God. But Samuel didn't arrive at the expected time, and Saul's soldiers began to desert, fearing the imminent attack. The pressure on Saul increased, and amidst growing anxiety, he made a decision that would seal his fate. He decided to perform the sacrifice himself, taking on a role that wasn't his. As soon as he finished offering the sacrifice, Samuel arrived. The prophet immediately realized what had happened and confronted Saul with a direct question. "What have you done?" Saul tried to justify his actions, explaining that the army was dispersing, the Philistines were ready to attack, and that Samuel had been delayed. He claimed that he felt he needed to act to avoid missing the opportunity to gain God's favor before the battle. But Samuel, with the authority of a prophet, severely rebuked Saul. He declared that obedience to God is more important than any sacrifice, no matter how noble the intention might seem. Samuel announced that because of this act of disobedience, Saul's reign would not endure. God had already sought out a man after his own heart, someone who would lead Israel with true faithfulness and obedience. This was a crucial turning point in Saul's life. What had begun as a promising reign was now threatened by the king's own impatience and lack of faith. Saul began to lose God's favor, and this loss was just the first in a series of acts of disobedience that would lead to his downfall. The people's confidence in his leadership started to waver, and Saul himself, feeling increasingly insecure, began a path of paranoia and fear. This moment marked the beginning of Saul's spiritual decline, revealing a king who, despite his appearance and strength, was deeply vulnerable to pride and insecurity. Saul's decision to disobey God under pressure was a clear sign that he was starting to stray from the path God had laid out for him. The tragedy of Saul, which began with so much hope and promise, was now unfolding, and the consequences of his actions would soon become evident to the entire nation of Israel. Saul's disobedience didn't stop with the improper sacrifice. The definitive breaking point came when he received a clear command from God through the prophet Samuel to completely destroy the Amalekites, a nation hostile to Israel, known for their cruelty and enduring enmity against God's people. God's instructions were clear and left no room for interpretation. Saul was to destroy everything: men, women, children, livestock, leaving nothing behind. The Amalekites were a people who had treacherously attacked Israel during their journey through the desert shortly after leaving Egypt. The divine order to exterminate the Amalekites was an act of divine justice, repaying the cruelty they had shown towards Israel. Saul, as king, was given the responsibility to carry out this sentence, demonstrating total obedience to God. Saul gathered his army and marched against the Amalekites. The military campaign was a success. The Amalekites were defeated, and their city was destroyed. However, in the midst of victory, Saul made a grave mistake. Instead of following God's instructions to the letter, he spared Agag, the king of the Amalekites, and the best of the sheep and cattle. He justified this disobedience by claiming that the animals would be used to offer sacrifices to God. When Samuel arrived to confront Saul, he was greeted by the sound of the animals that should have been destroyed. Samuel immediately recognized that Saul had disobeyed God's command. The prophet asked Saul why he had not followed God's instructions, and once again, Saul tried to justify his actions, saying that the people had spared the best of the flock to sacrifice to the Lord. But Samuel firmly declared a fundamental truth that would resonate through the generations. To obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed is better than the fat of rams. He explained that Saul's rebellion was as serious as the sin of witchcraft and that, because of this disobedience, God was rejecting him as king. Saul's act was not merely a failure to follow an order. It was a reflection of a heart that was drifting away from God, seeking to follow his own will instead of submitting to God's. What could have been a moment of redemption for Saul, confirming his loyalty to God, turned out to be the final breaking point. Through Samuel, God announced that the kingdom would be taken from Saul and given to another, a man after God's own heart. That man was David, a young shepherd from Bethlehem, who would soon be anointed to succeed Saul. In a final act of obedience to God, Samuel executed King Agag, completing the task that Saul had left unfinished. From that moment on, the relationship between Saul and Samuel was severed. Samuel deeply mourned Saul's failure, but he never saw him again. Saul, who had begun his reign with the promise of greatness, now found himself on an irreversible path. The weight of his disobedience began to manifest in his life in even more evident ways. He would continue to rule Israel for a few more years, but his reign was doomed. Without God's support, Saul became increasingly unstable. His insecurity turned into paranoia, and he began to see enemies everywhere, especially in David, who had not yet taken the throne but whose destiny was already sealed. By this point, Saul's story had begun to turn into a moving tragedy, a tale of how disobedience and rejection of God's will can lead to ruin. The opportunities that God had given Saul were wasted, and the kingdom entrusted to him would be given to another, someone willing to faithfully follow the Lord's ways. With God's rejection of Saul, the story took a darker turn. Although still the king of Israel, Saul became a man marked by fear, insecurity, and growing paranoia. From the moment Samuel announced that God had chosen another to be the next king, Saul found himself in a constant struggle to maintain control over a kingdom he knew was slipping through his fingers. The new focus of his paranoia quickly became David, a young shepherd who had been secretly anointed by Samuel to be the next king of Israel. David began to gain fame after defeating the Philistine giant Goliath, a victory that made him a hero in the eyes of the entire nation. Songs of praise for David echoed everywhere. Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. This comparison, sung in the streets by the women of Israel, ignited an uncontrollable jealousy in Saul. From that moment on, Saul no longer saw David as a loyal servant or a valiant warrior, but as a direct threat to his throne. The king, who had once looked upon David with favor, now saw in him the man who might fulfill Samuel's prophecy and take the kingdom from his hands. Saul gave in to fear and hatred, and these emotions began to consume his mind and actions. Saul attempted several times to kill David. First, he offered his daughter Michal in marriage to David, hoping that the dangerous military missions he required as a dowry would lead to David's death. But David exceeded all expectations and returned even more victorious. Next, Saul tried to kill David directly, throwing a spear at him while David played the harp to soothe the king. When this failed, Saul ordered his servants to assassinate David in his home, but Michal, who loved David, helped him escape through a window. David fled, and the pursuit intensified. Saul relentlessly hunted him throughout the desert of Israel, leading his army in search of the man he now saw as his greatest enemy. Even when David had the opportunity to kill Saul twice, once in the cave of En-Gedi and another while Saul slept in his camp, he chose to spare the king's life, saying he would not raise his hand against the Lord's anointed. These actions by David demonstrated his integrity and reverence for Saul's position, even knowing that God had rejected him as king. Saul's paranoia blinded him to David's loyalty. Each act of mercy by David only increased Saul's resentment and frustration. He increasingly isolated himself, mistrusting even those around him. His mind, once capable of leading Israel with strength and decisiveness, had become a battlefield, tormented by shadows of conspiracies and betrayals he had created himself. This relentless pursuit of David by Saul not only demonstrated the deterioration of his character, but also his growing estrangement from God. Instead of seeking divine guidance and correcting his ways, Saul plunged deeper into his own ruin. He turned away from the peace he could have found in God and surrendered to fear and violence. Saul's obsession with David became a symbol of his own downfall. He failed to see that by pursuing David, he was actually hastening his own end. Instead of protecting his kingdom, Saul was destroying it from within, consumed by a hatred that was eating away at his soul. This chapter in Saul's story serves as a powerful reminder of how fear, jealousy, and disobedience can lead to ruin. Rather than trusting in God and accepting his plan, Saul chose to fight against the inevitable, and in doing so, he lost not only his kingdom but also his peace, his sanity, and ultimately his own life. As Saul's paranoia grew and his reign deteriorated, he drifted further away from God. This distance led him to one of the darkest moments of his life, an episode that symbolizes his complete loss of faith and the despair that took hold of his heart. His consultation with the medium of Endor. The context was grim. The Philistines, relentless enemies of Israel, had gathered their forces for a major battle against God's people. Saul's army was camped at Gilboa, and the king, tormented by anxiety and fear, desperately sought divine guidance. However, God no longer responded to Saul. Not through dreams, not through prophets, not through the Urim, the usual means of communication between God and Israel's leaders. Saul was alone, without the divine direction he so desperately needed. This divine silence only deepened Saul's despair. Feeling abandoned and unsure of what to do, he made a decision that would take him even further from God. He chose to seek out a medium, a practice he himself had banned in Israel. In earlier times, following the law of Moses, Saul had expelled all mediums and spiritists from the land in an attempt to purify the land of practices that God considered abominable. But now, in a moment of extreme desperation, he turned to what he had once condemned. Saul, disguised and accompanied by a few of his men, secretly went to the town of Endor, where a well-known medium resided. When he arrived at her house, he asked her to summon the spirit of Samuel, the prophet who had once guided him but was now dead. The medium, initially hesitant, feared it was a trap, knowing Saul's prohibition. However, he reassured her, swearing by God that no punishment would come upon her. When the medium summoned the spirit, she was startled to recognize that the man before her was none other than King Saul. The spirit that appeared was identified by her as Samuel, wrapped in a robe. Saul, overcome with a mix of fear and reverence, bowed before the apparition and asked in desperation what he should do, as the Philistines were at war with him and God had turned away. Samuel, disturbed by being summoned, responded with a harsh and unforgiving message. He reminded Saul that God had become his enemy precisely because of his disobedience. Samuel announced that God's final judgment on Saul was near. The next day, Saul and his sons would die in battle, and Israel would fall into the hands of the Philistines. Samuel's prophecy was clear and terrifying. Saul's end was sealed. These devastating words left Saul shaken and powerless. He collapsed to the ground, terrified and utterly desolate. What began as a desperate search for guidance ended in a verdict of condemnation, a confirmation that he had been utterly rejected by God. The medium, seeing Saul's state, tried to comfort him. She prepared a simple meal, and Saul, though initially reluctant, accepted the food and ate before departing. That meal marked the last moment of respite before the final day of his life. Saul's consultation with the medium of Endor is one of the most tragic and dark episodes of his story. It symbolizes the total despair of a man who, instead of seeking repentance and reconciliation with God, chose to sink further into darkness. Saul had begun his reign with God's blessing, but in the end, he was completely lost, cut off from divine light, and consumed by despair. The next day, as Samuel had prophesied, Saul faced his final battle on Mount Gilboa, where he and his sons met their deaths, and Israel was defeated. Saul's tragedy was complete. A king who had started with so much potential, but ended his life as a stark example of the consequences of disobedience and rejecting God. The dawn of that fateful day brought with it the inevitable weight of the prophecy Saul had received. On Mount Gilboa, Israel's army prepared to face the Philistines, but Saul's heart was filled with fear and despair. He knew this would be his last day as king, and perhaps even his last day alive. The approaching battle was not just a military confrontation. It was the moment when the destiny Samuel had foretold would be fulfilled. As the combat began, it quickly became clear that the Israelites were at a disadvantage. The Philistines, strong and well-prepared, advanced with relentless force. Saul's troops, shaken and without divine guidance, began to falter. The situation worsened as the Philistines turned their focus to Saul's sons. One by one, the king's sons fell on the battlefield, including Jonathan, David's dear friend and one of Israel's most noble warriors. The death of his sons was a devastating blow to Saul, but the battle was far from over. The Philistine archers closed in on the king, wounding him severely. Surrounded by defeat and death, Saul knew that being captured by the enemy would mean even greater humiliation. The Philistines were notorious for torturing and mocking their prisoners, especially leaders captured in battle. Saul, who had once been the proud and chosen king of Israel, now faced a dark and dishonorable fate. In a final act of desperation and pride, Saul decided to end his own life. He asked his armor-bearer to kill him, but the young man, terrified and full of respect for the king, could not bring himself to do it. So Saul took his own sword and fell on it, choosing death by his own hand rather than falling into the hands of the Philistines. Seeing that the king was dead, his armor-bearer followed Saul's example and took his own life as well. Thus, Saul's reign came to a tragic and violent end, in the very place where he had faced his last great battle. The death of Saul and his sons marked not only the end of a royal lineage but also the collapse of a reign that had begun with great promise and ended in desolation. The Philistines, upon finding Saul's body on the battlefield, brutally desecrated it. They cut off the king's head and sent it as a trophy to be displayed in their temples, celebrating their victory and proclaiming the supremacy of their gods over the God of Israel. Saul's body was hung on the walls of Beth-shan, a public display of his defeat and a final humiliation for the king who had once been anointed by God. The dishonor inflicted upon Saul's body symbolized the complete collapse of his leadership and the loss of divine protection. Israel, seeing their king and princes dead and disgraced, was overcome with fear and despair. The nation, which had insisted on having a king like the other nations, now faced the terrible consequences of their choice. Yet, even amid this tragedy, there was a final act of loyalty and honor. The brave men of Jabesh-Gilead, the city that Saul had saved early in his reign, remembered his first great act as king. They traveled through the night to Beth-shan, risking their lives, and retrieved the bodies of Saul and his sons from the walls. They took them back to Jabesh-Gilead, where they buried them with dignity and fasted for 7 days in mourning. This gesture by the men of Jabesh-Gilead was a tribute to the Saul they remembered, the king who, in his early days, had fought for Israel with courage and justice. In the end, even amid dishonor and tragedy, there remained a trace of respect for the man who had begun his reign with God's blessing but had strayed from divine grace along the way. Saul's death on Mount Gilboa was not just the end of a king but the close of an era in Israel. It marked the transition from a kingdom based on human strength to the promise of a new reign, under the leadership of David, a man after God's own heart. But Saul's fall served as a lasting reminder of the consequences of disobedience and the loss of faith, leaving a powerful lesson for future generations. The news of Saul's death, along with that of his sons on Mount Gilboa, quickly spread throughout Israel, causing a mix of mourning and fear among the people. However, no one was more deeply affected than David, the man anointed to succeed Saul, who had suffered immensely under the relentless persecution of the king over the years. David was in Ziklag, a Philistine city where he and his men had temporarily settled, when a messenger arrived with the tragic news. The messenger, an Amalekite who had fled the battlefield, told David that Saul and his sons were dead. He brought with him Saul's crown and bracelet, symbols of royalty, claiming that he himself had killed the king at Saul's dying request, hoping David would reward him for this. However, the messenger's account contrasted with the true events, as Saul had taken his own life. Deeply moved and angered, David saw in the Amalekite's words a great disrespect toward the Lord's anointed. Despite being hunted and persecuted by Saul, David never lost respect for the anointing that God had given to the king. He ordered the execution of the Amalekite for daring to lift his hand against the Lord's anointed. After the execution, in an act of great nobility and sincerity, David composed a lamentation for the death of Saul and his dear friend Jonathan, titled The Song of the Bow. This elegy, which David ordered to be taught to the people of Judah, is a touching testament to David's character and his ability to forgive and honor those who came before him, despite all the suffering he had endured. David's song began with the words, "How the mighty have fallen in battle." He mourned Saul's loss, recognizing his achievements and the fact that, despite all his errors and persecutions, Saul had been the anointed king of Israel. David did not allow hatred or bitterness to taint his memory. Instead, he praised both Saul and Jonathan, highlighting the bravery and loyalty that had marked their lives. Jonathan's death, in particular, was a deep wound for David. Jonathan was not just Saul's son. He was David's closest friend, someone with whom he had formed a bond that transcended the politics and rivalries of their fathers. David expressed his love for Jonathan in a moving way, describing their relationship as something more precious than the love of women. The pain of losing Jonathan was something David would carry for the rest of his life. As David mourned, he also reflected on the lessons that Saul's downfall left for him and for Israel. He knew that Saul's tragedy was a warning about the dangers of pride, disobedience, and rejecting God's plan. David, now destined to be the next king of Israel, felt the weight of this responsibility, understanding that to avoid Saul's fate, he would need to remain faithful to God in all circumstances. David's lament also marked the end of an era. With the death of Saul and his sons, Saul's royal lineage was virtually extinguished, and the way was clear for David to take the throne. However, unlike a usurper who would rejoice in the fall of his predecessor, David approached this transition with humility and reverence. Shortly afterward, David was anointed king of Judah, the first tribe to recognize him as their leader, beginning the process of uniting the tribes of Israel under his leadership. But David's rise to the throne was marked by his recognition of Saul's failures and his sincere desire not to repeat the mistakes of his predecessor. Saul's story ended in tragedy, but it also served as a prelude to the rise of a new kind of leadership in Israel, one that sought to align with God's will. Despite his future failures and challenges, David began his reign with his heart turned toward the Lord, determined to honor the memory of Saul and Jonathan while guiding Israel into a new era of unity and faithfulness. The death of Saul and David's subsequent lament remind us that even in the midst of the greatest tragedies, there are lessons to be learned and honors to be given. David shows us that true power doesn't lie only in taking the throne, but in how we honor those who came before us and how we learn from their lives and mistakes. David's respect for Saul, even after death, is a testament to the kind of king he aspired to be, a king after God's own heart.